The night before the offensive was quieter than anyone expected. It was an eerie sort of quiet, the kind that didn't bring peace, but tightened the chest and prickled the back of the neck. The wind, which for weeks had howled across the barren hills like some restless spirit, had fallen utterly still, as if even nature had been warned to hold its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped, the sound swallowed by the heavy stillness. Private Edward Ed Thompson sat hunched on the cold, uneven ground, his greatcoat wrapped tightly around him. The rough stone wall at his back was all that remained of what had once been a village schoolhouse. The chalkboards were long gone, the laughter of children replaced by the hollow groan of a structure slowly crumbling into the mud. The bricks still bore scars from past shelling, splintered edges and blackened scorch marks, like the land itself had been branded by fire. Ed turned a small, weathered photograph over and over in his gloved hands. The edges had curled slightly, and a faint crease ran across one corner, but the image still shone clear. A woman with auburn hair, her smile warm and unguarded. Charlotte, his wife. She was likely asleep now, far away in a quiet street untouched by shellfire, her breathing slow and steady beneath the blankets. She couldn't know that tomorrow would be the sort of day that decided whether Ed would ever see her again, or whether the photograph would become all that was left of him. Around him, the camp murmured in low tones, voices kept deliberately quiet though there was no enemy close enough to hear. Men sat in small clusters, shadows bent over mugs of tea, their faces catching the glow of small, carefully shielded lanterns. Somewhere nearby, a corporal chuckled at a joke, the sound brief and brittle. The clink of tin cups carried in the air, along with the occasional metallic rattle of a rifle being checked for the 100th time. The faint scratching of pencils could be heard here and there, letters home, hurried and careful, trying to capture in a few sentences a world of longing, fear, and hope. The night smelled of damp earth and faint smoke, the kind that clings stubbornly to wool. Beyond the camp's dim glow, the hills rose like dark silhouettes against a pale moon. The moon itself hung high and distant, casting a silver sheen over the frost-hardened ground, turning every puddle into a small pool of reflected light. Long, thin shadows stretched across the dirt, reaching out like fingers toward the men who would walk into danger at first light. Sergeant William Will Hargrave approached, his boots crunching over stray gravel. He carried himself with the easy authority of a man who'd been through enough battles to know the weight of what was coming, and enough to hide that weight behind a calm face. His steel helmet caught a dull glint from the moon as he passed one of the dim lanterns. "Get some rest, Thompson," Hargrave said quietly, the tone more of an order than a suggestion. "Big day tomorrow." Ed looked up, his mouth forming the beginnings of a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah," he said simply, knowing full well that rest was impossible tonight. You could close your eyes, perhaps, but the mind wouldn't obey. Sleep was a luxury for those without the burden of counting hours, without the knowledge that each hour was drawing you closer to the moment when the whistle would blow and the world would erupt in fire and noise. Hargrave gave a short nod, his gaze lingering for just a second longer than necessary, as if trying to measure Ed's readiness in that brief glance. Then he moved on, his shadow melting back into the dim outlines of the camp. Ed leaned his head back against the cold stone, feeling its dampness through his cap. Somewhere, an owl gave a single low hoot before drifting away into the dark. He wondered if Charlotte was looking at the same moon, or if the winter clouds back home had hidden it away. He imagined her at the small kitchen table, a pot of tea steaming between her hands, perhaps rereading his last letter. He hoped she'd read between the lines and know he loved her more fiercely than he could ever put into words. The photograph sat in his palm for a long time before he tucked it carefully into the breast pocket of his tunic, close enough to feel over his heart. Tomorrow, when the artillery thundered and the sky turned black with smoke, he would carry it with him, not just as a keepsake, but as a shield, a reminder that somewhere beyond the madness there was something worth surviving for. The camp slowly thinned as men sought out their blankets and their shallow foxholes, but sleep remained stubbornly distant for most. The night held them in a kind of suspended moment, caught between what had been and what was coming. It was the last breath before the plunge, the final heartbeat before the storm. Ed remained awake long after the last whispers faded, watching the horizon for the first sign of light. It came not from the sky, but from the mouths of the big guns dug into the ridges behind them. The first salvo ripped the still air to pieces, a bone-deep vibration rolling through the earth. The ground itself seemed to flinch beneath Ed's boots as the shells howled overhead, their metallic shriek cutting the morning in two. Moments later, distant impacts bloomed on the far slope, plumes of fire and soil rising like angry geysers, scattering splinters of wood and stone high into the gray air. The acrid tang of cordite rushed into Ed's lungs, burning the back of his throat. Smoke drifted low across the churned ground, thick and bitter, clinging to his uniform. Somewhere in the chaos, a whistle blew, their signal. Advance. The order cut through the din, and Ed's legs obeyed before his mind could protest. His unit surged forward into the cold muck, boots squelching through a patchwork of puddles and shell craters. His rifle weighed heavy in his hands, the wood slick with damp. Ahead, the first rattle of enemy machine gun fire tore the air apart. The sound was sharp and metallic, each burst stitching invisible lines of death through the morning haze. Instinct yanked Ed low, his shoulders hunched, his head ducked as if the small act could keep him alive. Bullets hissed past, some close enough to slice the air beside his ear. They struck the mud with vicious splats, kicking up small fountains of dirt. Somewhere to his left, a man shouted, a short, strangled sound that ended almost before it began. Ed didn't look. He couldn't afford to. The line pressed on, weaving between the blackened stumps of trees that had been shattered into jagged spears by earlier bombardments. Every few yards, they dropped into a crater for cover before scrambling out again, knees sinking into the sucking mud. Ed's breath came harsh and quick, the cold air biting his lungs. In the distance, through the smoke, the outline of a half-collapsed farmhouse emerged, a dark silhouette against the pale light. Its roof sagged at an unnatural angle, and one wall had been torn away entirely, exposing the skeleton of the place. This was their first objective. Sergeant Hargrave's hand shot up, palm flat. The men dropped into crouches or pressed themselves against whatever cover they could find. Ed ducked behind the broken curve of a stone wall, the surface rough and cold against his shoulder. The enemy's reply came almost immediately. A volley of rifle fire cracked from somewhere beyond the farmhouse, striking the wall in sharp puffs of dust and stone. Larger impacts followed, chunks of brick leaping into the air, some spinning past Ed's cheek close enough for him to feel the rush of their passage. He swallowed hard, fingers tightening on the worn stock of his Lee Enfield rifle. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips, in his throat, in his ears. The rest of the world had narrowed into a small, trembling tunnel. The edge of the wall, the barrel of his rifle, and the faint outline of movement through the smoke ahead. Ed drew a slow breath, steadying his aim. His eye aligned with the sights, the black notch settling on the moving shadow. He squeezed the trigger, the shot cracking like a whip and jolting his shoulder back. Through the haze, he saw the shadow fold into itself and fall. Whether it had been a man or just the flicker of his own fear, he couldn't be certain. The uncertainty twisted in his gut, a tight, unpleasant knot. He told himself to focus, to keep firing, but the thought hung in the back of his mind like an unwelcome echo. The gunfire did not stop. If anything, it seemed to grow sharper, angrier, as though the enemy sensed their approach and fought harder to hold the line. Hargrave barked orders, his voice raw with urgency. Men shifted positions, firing in bursts to keep the defenders pinned while others moved forward. Mud splashed Ed's face as a bullet struck inches from his boot. He forced himself lower, pressing his chest against the cold earth, and began crawling along the wall toward a gap that offered a clearer angle. His breath came in sharp bursts, each exhale ghosting in the cold morning air. For a moment, between shots, the world seemed to pause. Ed could hear his own heartbeat, quick and insistent, and the faint whistle of the wind through the ruined farmhouse. Somewhere beyond that, men were dying, and the day had only just begun. By midday, the weather had turned against them. The first drops were hardly noticed, cold pinpricks against the skin, lost in the chaos of battle, but soon the drizzle became steady, unbroken, and utterly merciless. The rain was not a cleansing sort. It was a heavy, bone-deep damp that crept into every seam of a man's uniform. The ground, already battered by shells and churned by boots, became a sucking quagmire that clung to their ankles and stole their momentum. Ed's steel helmet collected water along its rim, sending thin rivulets down his face every time he moved. They mixed with the sweat and grime already on his skin, running into his eyes and blurring his sight. He could taste the rain, metallic and faintly dirty, as if it had swept through the smoke before landing. The fighting had settled into an ugly rhythm, something almost mechanical.
Move, shoot, duck, breathe.
Then again, and again. Each step forward was one at the cost of another burst of gunfire, another near miss, another body crumpling into the mud. The hours blurred together until Ed could no longer tell how long they'd been pushing forward, only that they had not stopped. The order came down the line. Push into the village. It was their next goal, and the heart of the valley. The place had once been home to hundreds, maybe more. Now it stood as a husk of itself. Blackened timbers jutted from the ground like ribs, the charred skeleton of houses still smoldering faintly in places where shells had found their mark. Roofs were caved in, leaving jagged edges against the gray sky. The cobbled streets were broken, littered with rubble, shattered glass, and the detritus of lives abandoned in a hurry. As Ed moved down one narrow alley, his boots crunching softly over bits of plaster and stone, something caught his eye in the debris. He slowed, his breath misting in the cold air. Lying half-buried beneath a layer of soot and dirt was a child's toy, a small wooden horse. Its surface was chipped, the once bright paint dulled and cracked, and one leg had been snapped clean away. For a moment, the sounds of battle seemed to dull in his ears. He thought of Charlotte, and of the long conversations they'd had in those brief, precious leaves back home. The way she'd smile at the idea of after the war, as though it were a place you could book a ticket to. They had talked about children someday, when the world was safe again. But standing in that ruined alley, the rain soaking his greatcoat, and the toy lying lifeless at his feet, Ed felt the weight of the truth. For so many here, after the war would never come. A sharp crack of rifle fire snapped him back to the present. The sound was followed instantly by the sharp ping of a bullet striking somewhere far too close. "Sniper!" someone shouted. Sergeant Hargrave's voice rose above the din covering fire. "Keep his head down." Training overrode thought. Ed dropped to a knee behind a crumbling wall, his fingers working automatically. The empty clip sprang from his Lee Enfield, replaced by a fresh one with a sharp, practiced motion. His gloves were slick with rain, but his grip held steady. He leaned out just enough to fire, aiming at the upper windows where the shot had come from. The recoil thumped into his shoulder, the echo of the shot lost in the overlapping bursts of his squad's rifles. "Move up." Hargrave's order came again, clipped and urgent. Ed rose and advanced, slipping slightly on the wet stones, the weight of the rifle firm in his hands. His breath came fast, his ears ringing from the constant reports. The air stank of wet stone, mud, and the sharp, acrid bite of gunpowder. Every breath seemed to carry the taste of cordite, clinging stubbornly to the back of his tongue. Somewhere ahead, the sniper would be reloading, or moving to a new perch. Somewhere beyond that, the fight for the village would continue. But for now, all that mattered was the next few steps forward. Late in the afternoon, they reached a two-story building on the edge of the village square. Intelligence suggested it was being used as a command post. The squad was ordered to clear it. The door was barricaded, so they forced their way in. Inside, dust motes swirled in the dim light filtering through bullet holes in the shutters. Footsteps echoed upstairs. Ed led the way up, rifle ready. The hallway was narrow, the walls pockmarked from past skirmishes. As he reached the landing, a figure burst from one of the rooms. Both of them froze, just for a second. It was a boy, barely 17, uniform too large for his thin frame. His hands shook as he held a pistol. "Drop it," Ed said, voice low but firm. The boy's eyes darted to the stairs, then back to Ed. His lips trembled. For a heartbeat, Ed saw not an enemy, but someone's son, dragged into a war he didn't understand. But the moment broke with a sudden motion. The boy raised the pistol. Ed's training took over. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The boy fell, his weapon clattering down the steps. Ed stood frozen, his rifle still raised, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Hargrave appeared behind him, gave a curt nod. "You did what you had to." But Ed wasn't sure he believed that. The village was theirs by nightfall, though theirs felt like a hollow word. The fighting had burned itself out slowly, like a fire eating through the last scraps of wood, each burst of gunfire growing further apart until only the sound of rain dripping from the broken rooftops remained.
But the cost was plain to see.
Half of Ed's squad was gone. Men he'd spoken to that very morning, faces he'd seen in the pale dawn light now erased from the earth. Their absence hung heavy in the air, a silence almost louder than the battle itself. The rain had finally given way, but the ground remained sodden, and the air still carried the war in its breath, thick smoke that clung to the nostrils, the metallic tang of blood that seemed to settle on the tongue. A strange calm had taken hold, as if the village were holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. The men moved slowly through the wreckage, clearing corners, checking for stragglers, claiming buildings for the night. Eventually, Ed found himself posted in what had once been a small house on the edge of the square. A shattered window offered a clear view of the dark hills beyond, jagged outlines against the faint silver wash of the moon. He sat on the dusty floorboards, rifle leaning within reach, staring out into the blackness. Somewhere out there, beyond the folds of the land, the enemy would be regrouping. He knew they'd be back. But for the moment, there was only the distance, the quiet, and the ache of muscles too tired even to tremble. His thoughts drifted to Charlotte. He pictured her at home, maybe by the fire, the light flickering against her hair. He imagined her looking out her own window, wondering if he was still alive, just as he sat wondering if she was still safe. The thought was a strange comfort, that perhaps across all the miles and the ruin, they might both be looking at the same night sky. The sound of boots on the floor behind him broke his reverie. Sergeant Hargrave stepped into the room, his shoulders heavy, the lines on his face deeper than they'd been that morning. He lowered himself into the broken chair beside Ed, its wood creaking softly under his weight. "You did good today, Thompson," Hargrave said, his voice low. Not the booming tone of orders, but something gentler. Ed shook his head slowly. "Feels like I did nothing but survive." "That's the job," Hargrave replied, eyes fixed on the darkness outside. "Survive. And hope that means someone else gets to live because of it." Neither man spoke for a while. Outside, the first stars began to pierce the smoky sky, faint and uncertain. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like far-off thunder, reminding them both that the war had not ended here, only moved a little further away for the night. Ed leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes for just a moment. The war was far from over. But for tonight, he was still alive. And for now, that had to be enough. Over the next week, between patrols and the endless grind of sentry duty, Ed managed to find small moments to write to Charlotte. The letters were neat, the handwriting careful despite the mud and cold. He filled them with safe topics, the weather, the quality of the rations, small observations about the countryside. Nothing that might trouble her. He never wrote about the boy in the hallway, the crack of sniper fire, or the way the screams carried long after the gunfire stopped. He knew she would read between the lines, as she always did, but some truths didn't belong on paper. They were things to be carried in silence. One evening, as the light was fading and the air turned sharp with the promise of frost, Ed was hauling crates of ammunition through the remains of a row of houses. The walls stood like broken teeth, jagged against the dull sky. His boots crunched over shattered tiles and splintered furniture, every step stirring faint ghosts of ash into the cold air. It was in one of these houses, half-collapsed and open to the wind, that he noticed a small bundle tucked into the corner of a windowsill. The paper was yellowed and creased, bound with a thin piece of fraying string. Curiosity pulled him closer. The letters were written in a careful, flowing hand, each curve and flourish speaking of someone who had taken their time. The words were in another language, one Ed could not understand, but their shape alone carried a strange weight. He imagined they might be love letters, or perhaps words to reassure parents or children. The thought made him pause. Somewhere, these letters had been read and cherished. Somewhere, an enemy soldier, maybe even one Ed had seen through the smoke, had been just like him, trying to hold on to a piece of home in a place that felt 1,000 miles from anything human. For a long moment, he stood there, the wind tugging at the pages. He didn't keep them. Instead, he placed the bundle back on the sill exactly as he'd found it. A small, silent gesture to a stranger he would never meet, but whom he understood all the same. Weeks later, the order came for the final push to drive the enemy out of the valley. It would be a dawn assault, the kind that had marked Ed's first day here, though now the faces around him were fewer and harder. The morning air bit at his skin, sharp as broken glass. Frost clung stubbornly to the grass, crunching under boots as the squad took their positions along the rise. Breath steamed from their mouths, hanging briefly before being snatched away by the wind. Somewhere behind them, the heavy guns waited like coiled predators, ready to roar. Sergeant Hargrave moved steadily down the line, his eyes scanning each man's kit, giving straps a sharp tug or adjusting a helmet with practiced hands. He said little, but his presence was steadying. When his gaze met Ed's, there was the faintest nod. More than words, it was permission to trust himself. The whistle cut the morning in half. They surged forward as one, boots pounding frozen ground. The air erupted in chaos, explosions tearing holes in the earth, the staccato hammering of machine guns shredding the quiet. Shouts rose and fell around Ed, some full of urgency, others of pain. The cold no longer mattered. The world had collapsed to the strip of ground ahead of him, every step another gamble. Midway through the advance, Hargrave went down. Ed saw him fall in his periphery, the sergeant's greatcoat darkening with a bloom of blood at the side. Hargrave. Ed was already there, dropping to the mud beside him. Without hesitation, he hooked his arms under the older man's and dragged him behind a low stone wall, bullets cracking overhead. Hargrave's face was pale, his breath sharp and ragged. "You've got to keep going," he rasped. "Not leaving you," Ed said, voice hard with finality. He pressed both hands to the wound, feeling the heat of the blood despite the cold. Another soldier appeared, and together they hauled Hargrave back towards the medic station, stumbling through the churned mud. Once they reached it, Ed hesitated only a moment before turning back towards the fight. By the time the sun began its slow fall, the enemy line had shattered. Smoke hung over the valley like a shroud, but it was theirs at last.